Tonight, I'd like to entertain you a little bit with some stories about the children's home. And it's very interesting because when I first started looking into all of this, a lot of us that are from Ashland or from the Ashland area, we believe a lot of things about this property and this house and what has happened here, how things have worked out, and we kind of tell stories. It's like telephone, it gets passed down. Someone tells you a story, and then another story gets told, and sometimes they get exaggerated, and sometimes not. But some of the things that we think we know about the children's home are not really what happened here. So, it's the big white house with tall pillars, because when people come down to the Historical Society and they go, well, which house is it out there? And we say, it's the big white house with tall pillars, and they usually can find it. Now, sometimes they go to the next house down the road that also is a white house with tall pillars, but we said it's the first house with tall pillars. And I think it's interesting because I think the children's home really is a commentary on our social conscience from the turn of the century until this point in time today, and how things kind of worked out for children, and what we believed, and how we took care of children, and what our thought process was, and what we felt our responsibilities were as a community. I think the children's home really tells that story of how that all evolved throughout time. So tonight we're going to talk about that a little bit. Now, the history that I'm going to tell you about tonight, I'm going to tell you about tonight comes from books that were published about the early pioneers that came to this area, court documents that we have at the Historical Society that tell us about the acquisition of this property and who lived here, newspaper articles. So some of the newspaper articles are so interesting, and it's fun to read newspaper articles and see how they talked maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago and how they talk now. When you read newspapers, it's just very different. And then we also have first-hand accounts of the people who worked and lived here. So we've actually talked to people who grew up in the children's home, who worked in the children's home, and they've told us quite a bit about that too. So is there anyone here this evening who was at the children's home or who has some stories about it?
My grandparents ran the children's home. Michael and Lena Dean.
Nice, okay, yes. So we encourage anybody who has stories about the children's home or knows anything about it, please come down and tell us. We'd love to videotape your story if you would allow us to do that, or if you would like to write something out for us and just make it part of the history of what we can add to the house, because there's a lot of history here. So, where did it all start? Well, in 1807, the land that the Frere home occupies today was surveyed by Jonathan Cox. He was a district surveyor for the United States government. Now, if you can imagine, at the time of that survey, no white people lived in any of this area. It was totally inhabited by Indians, and this was their hunting ground. A lot of Ohio was the hunting ground for Indians. Many Indian tribes shared this area for hunting. It was very wild. They talk about what the land was like. The way that the land got developed in this area was by land speculators. So after the Revolutionary War, the government would sell very, very large tracts of land to land speculators. Kind of like we do today. You know, when somebody buys a big piece of property and they want to develop it, Marcy's our realtor over here, so they sell off lots. Well, that's kind of what they did in this area. So people would come, they would buy land, and then they would sell off the pieces or the lots to the settlers who came here. So Ohio became a state in 1803, and this guy's out here surveying all of this in 1807. So the surveyors would stake out the land into townships. And this township that this house sits on was Montgomery Township. So William Montgomery, does anybody know who William Montgomery was? So William, yes, So William Montgomery was the first settler to Ashland. He's actually the person who laid out the land for what Ashland is. So we have, you know, Montgomery School, we have Montgomery Township. So when you hear that name Montgomery, that's where that came from. So again, as I said, this land was originally used as a hunting ground by all the indigenous Indians. And when they came here, the land was mostly forest, like what you see back behind you back here in Freer Fields. It was heavily forested. And then the forest would open up into little like glades or swamps. And so it was a great place for settlers to come because there were plenty of trees to cut down to build houses. There were already areas that were cleared off and ready to be planted. And so it was really a good place for settlers to come. I had a discussion the other day with Bob DeSanto. Do you guys know who Bob is? He's an attorney here in town. And Bob helps run the county park district. And we were talking about the most fertile land in the world. And Bob's a great farmer and he's very interested in all that. And Bob was saying that if you look on a map and you look at the area that we live here in the Ohio Valley, in this area, and then some land over in Europe, those are it's the most fertile land in the world. And the reason we were talking about it, because we were talking about people putting up like wind turbines and all kinds of things like that, and sort of ruining the land that we have. But we're really very fortunate to live in one of the most fertile parts of the world. And so it was great when these settlers came, they were like, wow, look at this great land. So, when they got here, they had to build some cabins, they had to set up their farm, they had to clear trees, and guess what it was full of? Well, it was full of black bear, deers, wolves, all kinds of things like that. So it was a pretty wild frontier. Snakes, I didn't put snakes on there, but almost every book that you read about this area, they tell you about how infested it was with snakes. But that didn't hold those settlers back any. Now the reason I have and pigs written on there is because there's some interesting stories about the most, I guess the most prized livestock that they could bring with them was not a cow, it was not an ox, but it was a pig. And they liked pigs because you really don't have to do anything too special with pigs. You can let them loose in the forest and they'll eat almost anything that they come across. And of course, you can eat pigs. And so the early settlers would get into disagreements because sometimes someone would shoot someone else's pig. There wasn't a good way to keep track of whose pig was who, and they weren't very easy to keep them contained. But they were a great source of food, and the settlers really depended a lot, believe it or not, on pigs. So I thought that was really interesting. So, the original land that we see here probably had some sort of a farmhouse on it. It's kind of hard to go back and look at the records and see exactly what sat on this land in the very beginning. I don't know how many of you know, but the Richland County Courthouse at one point in time burned down. So a lot of the records that we have about Ashland, before it was Ashland County, because originally we were a large part of Richland County, burnt up in the fire. So some records we still have, some records we don't have. But again, we know that William Montgomery originally had the land. And we also know that he sold the land to a man by the name of Croft or Craft. Now I thought this was interesting when I was doing my research because when William Montgomery laid out Ashland, there were 5 men in the beginning kind of living in that area. And one of the men, his last name was Craft, K-R-A-F-T. But when you look at the land records and what this piece of land was sold to, it was sold to a man by the name of Croft, K-R-O-F-T. And I just kind of wonder if it's the same person, because it says that the man that bought this land was a tanner. So he tanned hides and things like that. Well, the gentleman who lived downtown with Mr. Montgomery was also a tanner. So I don't know, I can't put 2 and 2 together, but it seems to me that that might have been one of the second owners of his piece of land. So I just found that interesting. Don't know if the two are tied together, but I think maybe they were. So next we come to who were the Freers. So everybody's familiar with the Freers, right? No? Yes, maybe. Well, Jonas and Mary Freer were pioneers in Ashland County. And in 1836, Mary Freer came to Rouseburg from New York City, where she was working as a tailoress. Now, she was 14 years old at the time. And I know this because I portrayed Mary a lot, so that's kind of fun to know that about her. Jonas Freer was working for his father, who was keeping a tavern in Rouseburg, Ohio. And Mary decided to come to Ohio with her brother at the age of 16, and she came to Rouseburg as a tailoress. So that's where the two of them met. So Mary and Jonas Freer met in Rouseburg. Now, they were married in 1836, and that's when they set up housekeeping. Just kind of as an interesting side note, 10 days after they were married, Jonas became very, very ill and almost died. And Mary nursed him back to health. And so it's said that Mary's dedicated nursing pulled him through. So very interesting. If Jonas would have died back then, we wouldn't have had a lot of things like the Farmers Bank and all kinds of things that we have here in Ashland. Now Jonas at that time was a teamster who hauled a lot of grain to Sandusky and Pittsburgh. That's what he was doing at the time. And he and his brother Randolph had this very prosperous transportation business of hauling grain. And the reason they were hauling grain off to Pittsburgh and Sandusky and some other places were Sandusky, they could get it up to the Great Lakes for shipping. And Pittsburgh, they could get it over to the Erie Canal for shipping it back east also. So that was kind of the route that they took. Later, they decided, you know, we're hauling all of this grain and we're kind of good with all the farmers around here, so let's open up a mercantile. So they decided to open up a store. And when they opened up their store, all of the people who were bringing their grain to town for them to take to the eastern markets decided that it was a good thing to keep their money in Jonas and Randolph's mercantile safe at night, because the First National Bank didn't open until 9 o'clock the next morning. Now, Ashland was kind of famous for all of its taverns, and so you probably didn't want to go sell your grain and be walking around with a big wad of money in your pocket at night and go to the tavern and risk, getting robbed or beat up or something worse. So they would put their money in the safe at the Freers Mercantile. Well, the Freers decided, if we're going to do this, we're operating a bank, we may as well open a bank. So Jonas and Randolph started the Farmers Bank here in town. So that's kind of how that bank got started. Good for them. So after that, the Freers went on to acquire a lot of tracts of land in Ashland County. And at one time, the Freers were probably the most prosperous people in Ashland County, and they definitely owned the most land in Ashland County. And this piece of land right here, this 96 acres, was some of the land that they owned. No, you're fine.
You turned it around on us.
I did, I flipped it on you, sorry about
Now
that.
everybody sees us coming.
So Mary Freer, Jonas's wife, she left kind of a controversial legacy here in Ashland. So who exactly was Mary Freer, and why was she so influential? Well, first of all, Mary was practically an orphan herself. Her mother died when she was just a toddler, and she moved to Ashland County with her brother, again, like I said, when she was just 16. And again, as I said, previously at 14, she had learned to be a tailoress in New York City, so that was kind of her trade. Now, she was obviously a woman of influence here in Ashland, and no doubt she supported and encouraged her husband in the things that he did, in his endeavors, his mercantile, his bank, his land ownership, his farming, all the things that he was interested in. Now, this was kind of unusual for a woman of her time, because think back to when this was. This would have been in the 1860s, 1870s. You know, at that point in time, women stayed home, they tended to the children, They ran the household. Oh, Mary wasn't so interested in that. She wanted to be involved in the community, and she wanted to get out there and be a mover and shaker and really make things happen. Now, during her lifetime, Mary would host a dinner for ex-President Rutherford B. Hayes in her house. And he came to town one evening on a train. He snuck in. They were expecting him the next day, but he snuck in, and he went to a hotel, so he got into town kind of quietly. But the reason that he came is because Mary had commissioned a Civil War statue for the courthouse lawn. So do you all know where that is? It sits on our courthouse lawn today. It's set there forever in the same spot. And she wrote to Rutherford B. Hayes, and she said that she wanted to commission this statue, and she would like him to come and speak at its dedication, and he did. And she had a big banquet at her home for him and a lot of dignitaries. So I think that was a big deal back in the day, and I don't think most women would have done that. Maybe men would have, but Mary took the lead, and that was important to her. She also felt that every church in town should have a lovely stained glass window. So she made sure that happened. She went to every church in town, and everybody got a lovely stained glass window. But what I think is interesting about that is she was also a responsible businesswoman. So one church got their stained glass window, but they exceeded the amount that she had allocated for them to get this window, and went back to her and said, "We need more money, we bought a bigger window." Well, the way Mary took care of that was when she died in her will, she didn't leave them as much money as she left the other churches, making up for the difference of the stained glass window. So I just think that's kind of cute. She didn't forget about that. She dedicated the bell in the tower of the First Congregational Church. She left books to the Ashland Public Library for the education of children. She raised 9 orphans in her home, because she herself was an orphan, and her husband Jonas never had any children. Now, when they say she raised 9 orphans, I take a little bit of exception to that because they were orphans, but they were also family members. So one of the orphans was her sister from out east. Another one was a niece of Jonas's, a nephew of Jonas's. So some of the orphans were family members too, and I don't know exactly that they were orphans, but for whatever reason, other family members had decided they didn't want to raise them, so Mary and Jonas did. Still quite commendable. None of those children were hers, but she raised them. And perhaps her greatest gift of all, of course, was the children's home. And as you will see here, for about the next 100 years, this gift to the commissioners of Ashland, the children's home, became very controversial. So, the children's home that almost wasn't. So, prior to the establishment of the children's home here on the Freer property, there was an orphanage here in the city of Ashland. It was located at 45 Cottage Street, and according to the 1900 census, there were 6 children living in that home. There was a matron, a servant, there's 6 children. That's really all we know about that. There wasn't a lot written in the history books about it. There's not much listed in Ashland about it. Really the way and what we know about it is off of the 1900 census. That's about all we really know about it. But what is known is that after the Civil War, many children were left as orphans or left with mothers that could not financially care for them. So they became wards of the state. And prior to the development of children's homes, these children were usually sent to either insane asylums or poorhouses. Now, insane asylums or poorhouses are no place to raise a child. So the federal government stepped in and mandated that states should set up a system for the care of orphaned children. So county commissioners were to establish taxes that would support the running of children's homes. And by the turn of the century, almost every county in Ohio had a children's home. And so, I don't know if most of you are from here, if you're from other places, but if you look back in the county that you came from in Ashland, there was probably a children's home there somewhere, and there's probably some history associated with it. And if not, the county next to you probably had a children's home that maybe 2 counties shared. So, perhaps because of the fact that Mary was an orphan herself, she decided that it would be great to leave this 96 acres out here to the county commissioners of Ashland and establish it as a children's home. And with the land, she also had about $30,000 to help maintain it, pay for it, whatever. And back then, $30,000 was a lot of money. Today, we don't think that's a lot of money, but back then, $30,000 was a lot of money. So, that was great, but when she passed away, everybody wanted a piece of her fortune. Now, because the Fair Farm was some of the most fertile, beautiful land in Ashland County, everybody thought, wow, there's a lot of money to be made there. So here's what happened. So a grafter, I don't know, I had to look up the word, okay? But a grafter is someone who is a politician or a public servant who obtains money unlawfully by using their position or their power. So it's very interesting because Mary Freer left an executor of her estate, and his name was George Allman. Now, George Allman, along with some other attorneys, F.M. Patterson, H.L. McCrae, R.M. Campbell, and of course George Allman, were all charged with divesting Mary's estate. For whatever reason, it took them almost 5 years to do so. Now, remember, there was $30,000 in the beginning of this, and after these attorneys charged all of their fees and said, this is what it costs us to get rid of all this, there was, you can't see it from back there was $1.44 left in the estate. So the $30,000 that Mary left to run the place, that's what was left. But they didn't get their hands on the property or this house. They did not get that. So the commissioners knew that they would be able to set up a children's home here. Taxes would be assessed, and that's how they would support the children's home.
What year did Mary pass away?
She passed away in 1901. Another thing that happened later, now this happened much later, but it's controversy around this piece of property, is that up here on Park Street, up where we have our beautiful new area up there that the Park Services has, and we can take a walk up there. Park Street is a beautiful street up at the other end of the field. But in the 50s, they decided that Park Street needed to be widened. It was cow path, it needed to be widened so that traffic could get through there. So they decided, let's do that. So the city bought, some land off the end of it up there to widen Park Street for $800. Now, in Mary's original will, it said that there were 4 churches who, if a children's home was not established here, those 4 churches were to divide her fortune between the 4 churches. Well, for some reason, I don't really know why, that $800, when they sold Park Street, these 4 churches jumped in on that and they said, hey, we were named in that will too. We have claim to some of that $800. We want some of that $800. And oh, by the way, if anything else happens to any of this land up here, we should get a share of it because our names were in that will. Interesting. So it went to court, okay? And here's what the court said. Here's what the local courts said, common police courts. They said, no. The commissioners have owned this land for all of this time. They've developed it. It was a farm. It's been a children's home. That's what it's for. You guys don't have any right to any of that money, nor do you have any right to that land, so no. Well, that wasn't good enough for those 4 churches, so guess what they did next? They took it to the Ohio Supreme Court. But guess what the Ohio Supreme Court said? They said the same thing. They sided with the lower court and they said, no, you're not entitled to any of that. You don't get any of that money. You don't have anything to do with it. So it was good to know that the Supreme Court sided with that. And again, the land stayed with the children's home. But even in the 1950s, somebody wanted a piece of Mary's fortune. So, okay, finally in 1907, the children's home opens. Now, it made an ideal location for a children's home because it was, at the time when it opened, about 1 mile from what you would consider downtown or the city. And that was great because that was far enough away to keep the kids out of trouble, and it offered plenty of space out here for them to play and to help with farm work and do all the things that they needed to do. So it was great. It was just far enough away from town. The Ashley County Commissioners hired a superintendent, a matron, a servant, and a cook, and 1 or 2 farm hands to help with the supervision and administration, and the children's home began. Now, it was a very self-sufficient institution, and believe it or not, I think this is crazy, but they grew most of their own food, and out here they grew green beans, peaches, beets, corn, blackberries, cherries, strawberries, plums, pears, potatoes, and other garden vegetables, and they canned them and put them up, and they were very self-sufficient with all of those things on their own. And then, of course, it was a working farm also. So, back there in the back, not 96 acres, but probably 80-some acres back there, they were planting wheat, they were planting oats, they were planting all the things that they needed to take care of their farm animals. So they milked their own cows, they slaughtered their own pigs, they had chickens, they had eggs, they made their own butter and cream, and when they had extra butter and cream, they sold it, so they made a profit from selling butter and cream. Anything extra they sold, and so it really was a very self-sufficient working farm. In 1936, I think this is interesting, the cost to the county for operating the home was 60 cents per child. And between 1936 and 1941, the average annual appropriation for the home, for the whole year, that the county commissioners had to spend was only $10,000, which I think is pretty amazing for the number of children that could possibly be here at one time. And a lot of times there were 30 to 40 children here. That's a lot of children for a house this size. So I think that's pretty interesting that that's all that it cost them. Now, the house didn't always look like it does now. I know it's hard to see in this picture, but originally it started out as just this little L-shaped farmhouse over here. And originally all it had when the first 14 children were here was the front porch, like you see right out here. So the front porch is original. It had a second story. It didn't have the big bump out on the front that you see out here. It was very flat in front. It was just a porch that went all across the house. There were 2 wings to the house, one over here, one for the boys, one for the girls. There were 3 little rooms across the back. One of them is where the matron lived. And at the time they just had the matron here. And then downstairs here was where the living room was, and over here was kind of like a kitchen area. So that's really all the house was. But as time went on, and more children showed up on the doorstep, because now things had started to happen. And now we started to have kind of a social conscience about what happened. You know, we got through World War I, and sometimes fathers didn't come back, and sometimes mothers had a hard time looking out after these children. So not every child who lived here was an orphan. Some children came here just because their family could no longer care for them or support them financially. And it's interesting, a lot of times you think about children growing up in the children's home from the time maybe they were an infant until they went out into adulthood, but it really didn't work that way. Children would come here for maybe a year. They might come here for 3 years. They might be 5 years. They might only be here a couple of months. But it was kind of a stopping off place for children to find a home. So even though we call it a children's home, it really was a stopping off place. And so when we get to the 30s and we're out of World War I and there's some fathers who can't come back and care for their children, and then we start thinking about the 30s too, we're into the Great Depression, people don't have jobs, people don't have any money, I can't care for my children anymore, I'm gonna leave them at the children's home. You know, these are the kind of things that were happening. So the 30s at the children's home probably wasn't a very happy time. At that time, they did build on to the children's home. So you see they built another wing over here because they had to make room for more children. And they also added the front of the home where you see the big columns there. So in the 30s, they did make the home bigger because they had to accommodate more children. There was a bigger need. Obviously, this is what it looks like today, but in the later 30s, coming up into the 40s, they built on the back part of the building that you see here. So if you kind of look from here back, this was built on, and then over on the other side of the building where the detention cells are now, those were always detention cells, those were rooms, and that was also built onto the back of the building too. So as time went on and different things happened in our history, there was a reason to build onto the home. So, you know, there was the Civil War, kind of in the very beginning, and then we had the Depression and World War I, sort of here in the early 30s, and then after World War II, still more built on because there was a greater need to have to take care of children. So, we see a little girl here, and she's got her little bag, and you see a little boy there carrying a box, and you know, this is how you come to the children's home. So we have pictures out front, in our front room out there, there's a desk out there, and you're a little child and you're coming to the children's home and you may or may not have any possessions. You might have a little suitcase, you might have a few things, you might not have anything, but you're gonna come here to live. Think about how you must have felt as a child. A lot of times, siblings were separated, so some siblings would stay with the family while other siblings would come here. Sometimes all of the siblings would come here because they didn't want the siblings separated. Now, another interesting thing that would happen at children's homes is that during sort of this time in the 30s, into the early 40s, you could be a child here and someone could come and say, I need some help at my house. I need a child to come and live with me here from the children's home and come help me at my home. I can't even fathom how that would work. I can only imagine how it could have been abused because, you know, we know things today that we didn't know maybe back then, or maybe we did know and we just wanted to turn our heads to it because people didn't talk about that kind of thing. But if I was a lady here in town and I felt like I needed help with my children and I needed help taking care of my house, I might come out here to the children's home, and if I could find a 13 or 14-year-old girl to come and live in my house, she would come live with me. She would still be able to go to school and do all of this, but she would live in my house and perform the chores, and I would pay her. Now, what I hear from people about that time is, yes, they did go live in those homes, and yes, they did perform the work, but they never really saw the money. So I think that's kind of interesting. What happened to that money when they turned 18 and they left here, they were able to leave here, they were supposed to have money. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. So I always thought that was interesting. If I'm a farmer and I need some help in the field, I come out here and I get a strong, strapping boy, and I take him to my farm with me, and he comes and he helps me do farm work. And I don't know, to me that seems like slavery, but that is how our society worked back then. Now, we do have stories of some people who were here, and I think this is kind of a funny part of the story, but they would line them up in the front room in there so that you could come in and pick the child that you wanted to come help you at your house. Well, sometimes the children would say they would pretend to have some sort of a fit, or they would make faces, or they would fall down and roll around on the floor just so that they wouldn't get picked, so that they didn't have to go and live at someone else's house. So, you know, those things are kind of a sad commentary on what it was like for them. So, am I going to live here? Well, here's how a typical day went in 1947. By 1947, we weren't hiring children out anymore, so I just want you to know that did come to an end probably a little bit before World War II. So everybody decided that wasn't a good idea. But a typical day. Up at 6 a.m., Everyone's up and out of bed. They head to their lockers. So they have lockers where they kept their clothes. And when the older children were finished washing and doing all the things that they needed to do, brushing their teeth and all of those things, it was up to them to help the younger ones. Because mind you, there was a superintendent and there was a matron, and there was probably 40-some kids living here. So, you know, one person cannot get all of those children ready. So the older ones really had to help with the younger ones. 7 a.m. Everyone must be seated at the long table for breakfast. So we know that this area back in here was a kitchen area, a big long table. This is where they ate their meals. The 5 smallest children at that time were in high chairs, and all the food that was served to them was raised on this farm. Now each child had a chore to do every day and was graded accordingly. Those who received unsatisfactory marks could not attend the approved picture show at the end of the week because they had their own camera, or they had their own film here. So if you didn't behave during the week, your punishment was you didn't get to go to the picture show. Money for picture shows, music lessons, and other types of education was provided by the Board of Trustees, so children did have an opportunity to be able to do some of those fun things. And there were also several radios and several pianos in the home, so children were encouraged to learn to play an instrument or do the things that they were interested in. Every Sunday in the summer, there was a picnic on the lawn, and cake and ice cream was served. So Sunday must have been a really special day. You got to have cake and ice cream, right? At 8 p.m., all of the younger children were put to bed, and the older boys and girls had to go to bed at 9 p.m. Now, each child was provided an adequate number of toys, but they said that they wore out really quick due to overuse, and I'm sure that everybody played with everybody else's toys. Dr. Sheets visited the home every Saturday morning to make sure that all the children were in good health. And the children were kept healthy with exercise both indoors and outdoors. And the woods and the yard and the farm and everything else really did provide a good place for children at that time to grow up. Not only that, but they were able to learn a skill. So when they did their chores, girls learned about cooking, they learned about doing the wash, they learned about doing all of those girl domestic things, which at the time, society valued that. And the boys learned farming skills. So they would go out and they would learn how to run the tractor. I think they would even learn how to hunt. We have a very interesting picture down at the Historical Society with all these little boys, and they have like shotguns. So they must have been teaching them how to hunt. But these were all skills that they felt if these children learn this, they can take this with them into their adult life. So I think that they did learn some important things here. Now, children attended school on the local level. And so during grade school, they would go to either Arthur Street or they would go to Osborne School. So Arthur Street was down on Walnut Street and Osborne was down on East Main Street. When the weather was nice, they would walk to school. When the weather wasn't nice, the children had their own bus, so they would bus them to school. Now, what I think is very interesting is we hear stories about the children walking to school. Now, boys did their thing and girls did their thing, and nary the two shall mix. And so when they were walking to school, the girls weren't allowed to talk to the boys walking home, and the boys weren't allowed to talk to the girls. And they would have someone from the school walking to make sure that that didn't happen. Sometimes neighbors would call and tell on them and say, well, we saw one of the girls talking to one of the boys, and then they would get in trouble when they got back here, which I find very interesting. As if your life at the children's home wasn't hard enough, the neighbors are gonna call up and tell on you, right? And some of the kids talk about that being very difficult for them because, like I said earlier, a lot of times children would come here because they didn't want their kids to be separated. And one girl tells a story in particular. She would be in the kitchen at night washing dishes, and her brother would be in the basement doing whatever he was doing down there. But they would yell to each other up and down the stairs because they really weren't allowed to mingle together or they just weren't allowed to have that much contact. And so she said it was very hard to be here with her brother, but never be allowed to have any, contact with him. So found that interesting. I guess I see why that would happen, but I think they kind of took it to the extreme. Once they got out of grade school, just like everyone else, they went to the junior high, they went to the high school. They tried to do all they could to integrate the children into just the regular families here in town and make sure that they got a good education. We already talked about chores, but girls did girls things, boys did boys things. You see some, you may not be able to see this very well, but there's some pictures here. Here's a little boy scrubbing the floor. Here's a girl down here, she's running the sweeper. This girl's hanging up some wash over here. And over here, these little boys are pushing push mowers. Not gasoline mowers, not electric mowers, not any kind of those mowers, they were push mowers. So when you look out here and see how far it is from this door to the street, that's a long way and a lot of grass to have to mow for some little boys. It was a working farm, so we talked about that. They milk cows, they slaughter pigs. They grew all of their own vegetables, and they really learned, I think, what it meant to be self-sufficient. So that was probably a good lesson for a lot of the kids who were here. Not everything was work, okay? They had fun and games too. And so, as I said, they had ice cream socials. They were encouraged to play outdoors. Every child had their own set of toys. And I think the matron and the superintendents here, all of them were good about trying to plan special events for them. We have pictures of traveling musicians coming and playing a show for them. We know that they got to watch a lot of movies. We know that in later years, the community was very good to them. They had TVs, they had record players, all kinds of things. So they got to do a lot of fun stuff too. Now, like any other household, crazy stuff happened here. A lot of crazy stuff happened here. So the first one that I want to talk about, I think this is so interesting, and if anybody knows anything more about this than what I do, I would love to hear it. But there was a little girl, and her last name was Benepi, and she was kidnapped, or so they thought she was kidnapped, and there was a massive manhunt for this girl, and she was a child who lived here at the children's home. Now, they thought that she was kidnapped by a guy who was wanted for writing bad checks and doing all kinds of nefarious things. And the reason they thought that he kidnapped her was because before she had come to the children's home, she babysat for this man and his wife and their children. And it just so happened that she disappeared on the same day that this hoodlum disappeared also. He was wanted too, so the police were after him, and they said that day, when she went to school, someone had witnessed a woman calling to her from another car. And she went over to the car, but then they didn't know what happened after that. So, this little girl is missing, she's 14 years old, this guy takes off, they think with her, they think he has kidnapped her, and the FBI is out looking all over for them, all over the country for them. They want to know what happened to them. But even more interesting is this little girl had accused her father, not the guy who kidnapped her, but her father of an incest and rape charge, and he was being held in the county jail pending her testimony in her allegations toward her father. Well, with her missing and gone and not being able to testify at this trial, they had to let the father go. So they let him go. And he never did get convicted. And then I can never find out what happened next. I've looked through newspapers, I've looked to see what happened to this girl. I don't know what happened to her, so I said to myself one day, I'm gonna get on Find a Grave and see if I can find this woman. So I got on Find a Grave, and here's what I found out about her. She was alive, she lived in New Jersey, she married a gentleman from, I think it was Philadelphia. They lived out in the New Jersey area for her entire life. She passed away when she was 57 years old or something like that, and she had 2 children or something. So, if she was kidnapped, they must have found her, right? And I don't know how she got back to where she belonged, but I did find her, and, yeah, she grew up, she got married, and moved on. So I don't know what the rest of that story is, and if anybody ever finds out what it is, I would love to know. I just cannot find the rest of the story. Another very controversial thing that happened was some boys burned down the barn. Now, one of the things that we like to believe about this particular property is that barn was built in 18-something or 1901 or whatever. It's a fairly new barn. It's built in the 40s, okay? Because these boys burned down the barn. Now, here's what happened. So, the night before the barn got burnt down, two of these little boys got into a fist fight, okay? And the superintendent and the matron said, we can't be having children having fist fights here, so you're both going off to bed with no dinner, and they sent them off to bed with no supper. So the next morning, these two boys and another little boy decided, we're gonna skip school, we're gonna burn down the barn. So they did not go to school, they went over there in the woods and hung out until everyone had left. Well, when school started, everybody was getting nervous. Where are these three boys? We don't know where they are. And the police and the sheriff and everybody was out all over town looking for these boys. What happened to these three boys? We don't know what happened to them. Well, I'll tell you what happened to them. They went into the hay mow of the barn out here, and they had hid some matches out there, and they lit them, and they burnt down the barn. So at noontime, fire trucks and everybody is arriving here at the children's home, and back in the day, kids would come home for lunch, so the bus was bringing the kids home to have lunch, whatever, and the barn is burning. It's a total loss. It kills a horse, it ruins all of their equipment, their tractor burns up, their cultivator burns up. It's a total loss. Back in the day, it was like a $10,000 loss, totally gone. So they probably would have gotten away with it, but one of the little boys left his school notebook in the pig pen, which was not attached to the barn. And one of the sheriff's deputies found the notebook and said, that's odd, we've been looking for this little boy all morning long. Why is his school notebook in the pig pen? So they went out here in the woods and they started searching around, and finally they searched around and they found these three boys, and they admitted to burning down the barn. Now here's where the controversy comes in. So when you go back and you look at the newspapers of the day, it took them 30 hours, that's not very long, to convict these three little boys of burning down the barn, and they were going to send them to the Lancaster Boys Correctional Facility in Columbus. Now, that wasn't a place for delinquent boys. That was really a place for hardened criminal boys. And when you read the articles in the newspaper back in the day, all the letters to the editor, okay, three little boys burnt down a barn, they were 11, 12, and 14, I think. Terrible thing, they shouldn't have done it, they should be punished, but should we really be sending them to this boys' correctional institution to teach them really how to be criminals, okay? So there was a big controversy about it. It only took them 30 hours to make this decision. So it kind of makes you wonder how much thought really got put into it. After many, many letters to the editor in the paper, after this big public outcry, the youngest boy ended up back here at the children's home, and the two older boys were put in foster homes with very strict parents, and the judge had given the directive that these two older boys must attend church every Sunday and must account for every bit of their time with their foster parents. But the good news is, at the end of the day, these boys did not have to go to this hardened criminal correctional facility. Quarantine. This was an interesting story. So there was a woman who was unable to care for her children. Her husband, I find this bizarre, was in jail because he could not get a job and pay his bills to support the family. So rather than helping him find a job so he could support his family, they put him in jail. Okay, so now this woman and her 5 children have nowhere to go. They have no money. She has 5 children, four very small children and a baby. So she shows up on the steps of the child welfare office downtown and says, here we are. I can't care for these kids. My husband is in jail. I have this baby. I have these 4 children. I don't know what to do. No one will help us. Okay, well, the normal way of getting out to the children's home was through the courts. But this woman wasn't going through the courts. She just couldn't do it anymore. Had nowhere to go. So the Salvation Army stepped in and they decided that these children needed some clothes and needed some other things. So they stepped in and they tried to help with that. And the superintendent out here at the children's home said, look, we'll take them. But the problem was these poor little children had lice, scabies, they were malnutritioned. The father had been in jail for quite some time, and the mother had been living in a place that was really run down. They had no money for food, nothing. So they're like, what are we gonna do with these children? We can't just mix them in with the other children because they'll make them sick too. So in the basement, downstairs, if you've ever been in the basement here, it's a scary place. Even back then, it was a scary place. But they set up some beds for these children. They washed all of their clothes. They nursed them back to health. In about 3 weeks' time, they were able to be integrated with the other children here in the children's home. And they were able to live here until the father got out of jail and got on his feet. And a home was secured for them. And then they were able to be put back together as a family. So I think that's kind of a good story. But when I think about this, I think about have times really changed that much? I mean, we still have people who need homes. We still have families who get separated. We still have people who don't have a place to live, no matter what kind of things we try to put in place in our society. You know, people still drop through the cracks. And what the really heartwarming message of this story was, when the community heard what had happened to this family, a lot of people stepped up to the plate to make sure that something horrible wasn't going to happen to them. And today, I don't know if we do that today. I think we're kind of hardened to, you know, hey, if you gotta go out and live on the street, or if you're living out of your car or whatever, well, you know, go get a job. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes there's other circumstances. So I think it just gives us a chance to pause for a little bit of reflection. So here's a happy story, or at least partly a happy story. I'm going to tell something at the end that my staff always hates it when I tell this part of it, but Black Beauty and Tony the Pony were 2 horses that were promised to the children's home, to the children at Christmas one year. So the Paint and Saddle Club here in town said, we want to give you these 2 ponies, your kids will love them, the kids can ride the ponies, they're gentle, whatever. So here we go, you're going to have the ponies. So this is Black Beauty over here, and this is Tony the Pony down there. And it was really a big deal. I mean, it made the Cleveland Plain Dealer, it made the Akron Beacon Journal, all the local newspapers reported on it. The kids loved it. When the ponies came, there was a story about all the kids lined up and they said, oh, it's my turn, I want to ride the pony first. Whose turn is it? Oh, come on, Susie, you can ride the pony with me. And the kids were in love with these ponies. They loved them. Now, the bad part about this story is, and I don't know why I'm laughing about this, it's not funny, but it's ironic, I don't know, maybe. But anyways, they loved these ponies, rode them all the time, but one day, poor Tony the Pony, over here, was out in the field out there, and they did not get him in time when there was a lightning storm, and poor Tony the Pony got struck by lightning and was killed. So they won't have that. So put your ponies away when it storms. So the community always came out together and really helped them out here at the holidays, which I think is very heartwarming and is great. And we see a lot of that in our community still today. So I think that's one of the great things that makes Ashland kind of special. I think people really do chip in and, you know, we do try to help each other. And they did that out here too. So I think this is really fun. These are pictures of the kids from the children's home at different Christmas parades where they would dress up, they would make a float, And they won a lot. When you look back at the newspapers of the 1950s, they had these big holiday parades, and the children's home always had a float in the holiday parades, and most of the newspapers that I look at, they either got first or second place, which was great because you would get money for getting first or second place. And back then, it was kind of a sizable sum of money. You get like $100 for first place. So I think that's cool for the kids, and I think that would have been really fun for them. Now, Santa came to the children's home in 1946, I think like no other year, okay? The Times-Gazette always would run a big fundraiser for the children's home. And I mean, they would go out to all of the factories in town and they would say, you know, fundraiser for the children's home, we're gonna get them toys, we're gonna get them all the things they need, we're gonna get them things that they want, not just things that they need. We really want things to be great for them out there. And in 1946, you guys, they went all out in 1946. So, some of the things that happened that year, they got, hold on here, Mary Ellen Wolfe was the reporter for the Times-Gazette that year, and she wrote many, many articles. And Santa's list that year included more swings, they needed more swings, a merry-go-round, they wanted a merry-go-round, a basketball goalpost, heavy-duty wagons, even a pony. That was the year that they asked for Black Beauty and Tony the Pony. In addition, they needed basketballs, footballs, bicycles, and any similar items that could be used by children ages 4 to 17. And they stated that all of the girls who were living here at the home at the time would like to have a new doll. Another item on the list was a movie projector. And reporter Wolf said, and I quote, "It will take money. Money acquired by residents digging down in their pockets and sharing their Christmas with these homeless waifs." So she was really appealing to the community to help out. Now, needless to say, that year, the children got 2 ponies, individual gifts, and not singular, plural, individual gifts for all of the 27 children who were living here at that time, a projection machine, an outdoor basketball court area, a phonograph, dolls for all the girls, scooters, tricycles, bicycles, wagons, games, books, a 9-foot silver Christmas tree, boxing gloves, not sure about that, a pinball machine, pogo sticks, doll buggies, children's desks, a blackboard, boxes of balls and balloons, and so much more. So I think the community really came together that year and really made it so that the children's home was able to have a nice Christmas. So funding ends, and so does the children's home. So our community and our government figured out that maybe a children's home was not the best place for children to be sort of warehoused. So we talked about some of the good things that happen with children, and we talked about some of the not so good things that happen with children here. But the government started cutting funding for children's home because what they really wanted to move toward was foster homes and responsible parenting. So funds kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And, you know, pretty soon the government said, we're not gonna support these big children's homes. You know, so if there's more than 9 children living there, there's no funding for that. And we really moved toward what we see today as kind of the foster home process, or, you know, trying to keep families together, which really in the long run is the best thing to do. Try to keep families together if you can. So down here you see finally the children's home becomes a home without a purpose. There's no children here, there's no detention center here, there's really nothing here. And you know, what are we going to do with this house? The children's home is done. So that brings us to what we have today. So the Historical Society was very fortunate to be able to purchase this property from.
What year was it that the no tenants in the home? Did you say that, Kim?
Hold on a second here. The children's home closed in 1989. And then after 1989, home was used for a lot of nonprofits, had offices here. At one point in time, this building was used as the Department of Human Services for a while. So, I mean, the building had purpose, but then finally it just had no purpose. There was no one left out here. The detention center was gone, the nonprofits were gone. The county commissioners owned the building, and they were really trying to decide, you know, like, what do we do? What do we do with this building? And so the Historical Society said, we'll take it over, we'll see what we can do with it. So we went, we got a grant to do some work to the building, and we thought, you know, we can use it as additional space. We have kind of a nice little rental space here. We have little fundraisers out here. You know, we have our museum upstairs, and we keep building and building kind of on what our museum exhibits are. So the building has really worked out beautifully for us, and we just feel it's a nice addition to the Freer Field area. So that's kind of where we're at today with the children's home. So we feel very blessed and very fortunate to be able to have this facility. So, yeah.
Was it a children's home and detention center at the same time?
It was.
How did that work?
At one point in time, it was both. And they were very careful to keep the two separated. So the detention center was on that side of the building. It looked a little bit different than it does today. There were more doors, more locked areas, so no one from the detention center could get onto this side of the building. So it was kind of like one big building, but two buildings. But for a time, both of them operated here at the same time.
How did Mary Freer get all her money?
So they had her mercantile, they had their store, they were Teamsters, so they ran all of that grain for people, so they charged them for that. They were landowners, and obviously they didn't farm all of the land that they owned, so they had people or tenants living on their farms, and they would make money that way, and then they owned a bank. So, you know, those are all the ways that they were able to generate money.
When I was a kid in the 50s, speaking of the detention, I could remember as a kid, we'd say amongst each other, if you do something wrong, you're going to be sent to children's home. I mean, it was a scare tactic that was used on us. And, and a lot of times you would always hear, you're going to be sent to children's home. So I wonder what the kids did that were in detention here. I mean, do you know any of the crimes the kids?
You know, it was, so, was it last month was detention? Yeah, last month was the people who ran the detention center were here last month. So it could have been a lot of different things that they did. They could have stolen a car, they could have skipped school, they could have been, truant for so many days, or, you know, there was just a lot of reasons that you could be out here, you know, in the detention center. So kind of interesting, just kind of interesting when you see the cells and you see what it was like to be in the detention center. Now, it's funny because when they were redoing this building, some of the workmen who were out here doing some of the remodeling, whatever, they would say, oh yeah, I remember I spent some time in one of those cells. There's 26 blocks to the top, and there's 32 bricks across the row, and that's on the one side. You know, like, you know, there was not a whole lot to do, so you just had to sit there and count the bricks. But I'm telling you, it is a cement slab, and on top of the cement slab is a mattress that was about this thick, and that was it. And they gave him a blanket. Sydney's more of an expert on the detention center than I am, but it was not very comfy. No, it was, you know, you definitely did not want to come back here if you had to go to the detention center.
And now, as I recall visiting, there were cells downstairs.
Yes.
And the detention people, what was the difference? I mean,
So the boys were downstairs, in the downstairs cells, and the girls were upstairs.
okay.
Yes, so, yeah.
Those really look like jail cells.
They are jail cells. Yes, they are the jail cells with the toilet and the sink in the jail cell with the, it definitely was something that if you got sent to the detention center, you weren't gonna go back.
So how many years was this, did they have the detention center running out of the 120
But they closed in
1980s until.
89 or 80,
So less than 10 years of history.
Till 2013.
2013, yeah.
Okay.
So it was,
That's longer than 10 years.
it was here for quite a while.
23 years. okay.
Yeah.
Were there issues with Delroy being so close as well when the children's home was operating?
So at one point in time before Delroy was built, Delroy actually operated out of this building for a little while too. They had a few rooms that they operated out of here. And then Delroy was built and they moved over there, but I don't know of any issues that there were ever with any of that. Delroy, what we see today is like a beautiful big building over there, but I remember growing up as a kid, it wasn't a very big building. Do you remember? It wasn't a very big building. It was really a small building and it's been built onto and built onto and built onto, but, yeah, I don't think there were any issues with that I'm aware of.
Sometimes Delroy School would supply the meals for the detention center because they were so close.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
And the reason they were allowed to put Delroy School over there is because part of Mary's will stated this had to be used for the benefit of children.
Yes.
And since that was a school for the disabled children, that's why they were allowed to use that and build that building over there.
That's interesting. So, actually, what Mary's will said was that a children's home had to be built on this property, period. Now, it depends on who you talk to as to how you want to interpret Mary's will, right? But a very interesting article, back when they were talking about the expansion of Park Street, written by Bob DeSanto, who at the time was the, prosecuting attorney, I think, yes. But Bob's sort of take on Mary's will was that really this land did not have to be for children, because the will said, all the will said was a children's home would be established on the property, which it was. What the county commissioners wanted to do with the rest of it, I guess, was up to them. But I think, Barb, you're a former county commissioner, I think that our county commissioners always made very wise decisions about that, because even though Mary didn't say those words in her will, I feel like that would have always been her intent. Yeah, that would have been
And
the
that's what they
intent.
went with.
Yes, and that's what they went with, and I always thought that was a very wise decision. And I think it's such a beautiful area in the middle of our town. Like, how lucky are we to just have this beautiful walking area and fields and woods back here? I mean, it's beautiful, and I'm glad that our county commissioners and people who were responsible for this land kept it like it is. It's beautiful.
This is a gem of Ashland, in my opinion. It's this
Green space.
green space right here that's so accessible and walkable. What an amazing gift, and it's historic. It's just, it's amazing that it's here.
It's lovely. It's so lovely.
Yeah, well, not being a native Ashlandburg, when we did move to town, this was '89. So that's why I was wondering, because everybody kept saying, well, that's the children's home, they can't build anything there. Because when we bought just around the corner, they said, oh yeah, that will always be green space. So that was and I guess, obviously, because that's what the intent of the will was.
Yeah, I don't know, Barb, you might be able to talk to that better as an ex-commissioner. I mean, I think that always was kind of the idea for the.
That was always the idea. And, all the attorneys had different interpretations of what the will meant. And eventually also the commissioners did break off a piece out here because Samaritan Hospital needed a place for a helicopter at one point for them to come in. And they, then it went back, well, the will was really broken when they put Park Street in. And the commissioners did abide by her wishes to have a children's home, which was, built, maintained, funded liability was the biggest reason that they closed down. And the same thing with the detention center, the liability. And so now we contract with another county, and we found out it's much better to send those kids to another county and get them away from the influences than sometimes even the parents, you know, coming here weren't a good thing for the kids, and it's best that the parents don't travel to the other county. But it's been interpreted so many other ways, but that's one of the reasons the county eventually turned all of this land over to the Park District, except these buildings. We split out so that Delroy School, they never really owned their property over there. It was all county property and all the Freer property. So when the Historical Society said they had an interest in it, then we parceled it all off and gave Delroy School their part, gave the Historical Society this building, and then the Park District has the rest of it. And the Park District, you know, has no intention. I'll be speaking next week.
And next month, Mark Crew will be our. Yeah.
Kim, one point on that too is that, you know, in the wills, it says for the children or for an orphanage of Ashland County. And so that is what is, the whole big determination of, okay, you think, well, here it is in the middle of the city, why didn't it become a city parcel or a city park? And in a sense, no, it was directed underneath the county commissioners caretaking for the county, and so that's why the Delroy School made such a beautiful fit, because the children from Loudonville, Hillsdale, Mapleton came together, children from all the county,
Right.
to a facility here, whereas not a city school, like an elementary, there was a big push when we were hunting for an elementary to put it right up there in the corner, but that did not go.
Yeah, remember when we were all trying to decide where we were gonna build our high school and what we were gonna do and how that was gonna happen, and I mean, I think everything just fell together beautifully as it should have, because all those facilities up there are really wonderful, they're beautiful, so I think that's nice that we have that.
And it was a struggle. People were unhappy. They felt that school needed to be built right there, and, you know, again, it would be used by kids. But if you give that to the Ashland City School District, what do you do with the county schools? So.
It all worked out for the best,
It did.
it's beautiful.
It did. It took a while to gel, but it all worked out.
Yeah, it's so nice. One of our next big initiatives that we'd like to take on out here is all of these everything that you see here, the barn, the house, the garage, Delroy School, are all listed on the National Historic Register. And so, you know how you have a little sign out in front of a historic building, it's in the shape of the state of Ohio, or, you know, whatever. So that's one of the next things that we'll probably start taking on, is getting one of those markers and, you know, having that put out here so that people, when they drive by, they see that. It's an expensive proposition, but there are different people that you can get a grant from in order to be able to get that, and then you kind of get on a waiting list, and so it takes some time, but we feel like we have this done enough out here now that we can actually put up the sign, we can say this is on the National Historic Register, we're open, you can come see the museum, and so that's kind of our next step. So we hope in the next couple of years we'll get that marker put up, and that would be really nice for our area out here to know that it's on the historic register.